So in the last on the last episode, if you were with us, we talked about how to read and interpret a soil test. We went through the chemical side, we went through the biological side, and we talked just a little bit about base saturations. And I would say, I don't know about you, Sean, but for me, that's a question that a lot of people always ask me. How do I read base sets? How do I interpret base sets? What are they really telling me? And then the most common thing is of course, how do I increase them, right? How do I improve the nutrients in there? And I think maybe the easiest way to do that is to just come to the whiteboard. I have a couple examples that I like to use that really, in my opinion, help maybe make sense of base saturations and how it works. So we're going to use the soil sample that we used in the previous week's episode. So we've got a 17 CEC. So we have a CEC of 17, which CEC, for those that you might not be familiar, is cation exchange capacity. As we move over to the base sats, we have a base sat calcium of 78%, magnesium of 20%, potassium of 2%. We have a hydrogen reading of 0, and a sodium reading of 0. Now, what this is this is a calculation of your cations that are used to calculate what those total base sats are. Now, if you have high levels of sodium readings, that's typically not a good thing, not something that we want to see. Sean actually would be a little more familiar in his area behind and lower CECs and some sands, reclaimed oil wells. We don't typically see that where we're at here in central Indiana, and as we move across central Illinois into central Iowa, sodium's not something that we typically struggle with. Hydrogen, so hydrogen occupies the space that calcium wants to. So what I tell people is, if you see a hydrogen show up on your soil test, the very, very, very next place that you should instantly look would be your pH, right? And so what that's telling you is that if you have exchangeable hydrogen that shows up, not that hydrogen is a bad thing, but it helps you understand that if you have hydrogen there, you likely have a little bit lower pH. And if you remember, Sean talked about this was a 7.2 pH soil. We knew that it has a limestone gravel underlay, likely why our pHs are typically more elevated on this piece of ground. So we've got a hydrogen of 0, obviously because of where our pH is at. So here's what we're going to go through. So we talked about calcium being a 78%. We talked about magnesium being 20%, potassium being 2%. So I usually use this thinking about a dinner table, right? You know, most of the time you've seen me hidden behind the chair, but if you look, I don't get a rockin' body like this missing dinner, okay? So I like to use a dinner table because it resonates with me. So we're going to think about this big old circular table here, right? So we got this big circular table here, which represents our CEC, right? And so Sean's already got this. That means that there's 17, we're going to call these 17 chairs, or representing an exchange site. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Okay, so here's our CECs. This is each one of them. So this equals a CEC of 17. So that means that we have 17 exchange sites to be able to hold these cations. So I'm not good enough at math to be able to do this in my head, so we're going to have to pull out our calculators and we're going to calculate this. So Sean, if I have a CEC of 17 and my base sat calcium is 78%, how many chairs do I have occupied by calcium?
13.26 chairs.
Okay, so we're going to take this one, we're going to occupy him, this one as well, this one as well, this one, one more, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yep, that's 13.
Okay, and then 0.26, right? 0.26 of this one is calcium as well. All right, now we move down and we go from calcium, then we go to magnesium, and we're at 20%. So we have a CEC of 17, our mag is 20%. How many chairs do we have occupied now by?
3.4 chairs.
Okay, so now we have 0.4 of this one is mag. Then we have mag. We have mag. And we have mag. Now, for those of you that are looking at home, you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, that's a whole lot of calcium. That's a whole lot of magnesium. But all I hear about is how important potassium is. So where does potassium get to have a seat at the table? So if I have a base saturation of potassium at 2, on a CEC of 17, how many chairs do I have occupied by potassium?
0.34 chairs.
0.34 chairs. So I have the remaining of this is 0.34 occupied by potassium. Now, this is where the story gets a little bit more interesting. Okay, so let's talk about charges, right? In the last episode, we talked a little bit about cations, we talked about anions, and we just talked about base saturations are all cations, right? There's no anions that go into being figured into your base saturation. So, calcium, for those of you that are at home, I'll give you a second to answer this, right? Is calcium a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4 plus charge, right? Well, we know that calcium is a 2 plus charge, right? So calcium would be designated with a 2 plus charge, so you would typically see it Ca++, right? Magnesium, same question. Is it a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4 plus charge? We know that it is also a 2 plus charge. We get into potassium. Sean, is that a 1 or a 2 plus charge?
It's a 1.
How about hydrogen?
It's a 1.
How about sodium?
It's a 1.
Okay, now, if you guys didn't love chemistry in school, you might have not paid attention to this. And if you didn't pay attention to this, no worries. I didn't pay attention either. It is extremely difficult. And when I say extremely difficult, I mean, let's just call it impossible for a single plus charge cation to ever displace a 2 plus charge cation. So what am I telling you? I'm telling you is that look at your base saturation. Sean made a comment earlier in the last session, and he said, I always want to make sure that I'm looking at base saturations. Why? Everybody has a little bit of a different reason for why looking at base saturations, right? pH is great. Buffer pH is also great. Understanding, do I need to be adding lime? Base saturation calcium is going to share a couple of things with you. One, if I have a really high base saturation soil, I likely have a soil that is probably properly flocculated, right?
Right.
Not going to be terrible drainage. Now, if I have a low calcium and a high magnesium, what do I have, Sean?
That soil's going to be tight.
I have a tight soil, one that's probably going to respond to some sort of a tillage. It's going to respond to a gypsum application. Anything that you can do to drive soluble calcium in there to improve flocculation of that soil so that you get some percolation of water.
So think about it, if you walk out in a field in the springtime, I always use this analogy. I remember when I was a kid, my dad and I, we used to like to go arrowhead hunting out in the fields, right? And you'd do that in the spring or in the wintertime when things were wet. And so you'd have your rubber boots on, and when you walk across a field, if every step you take, if the mud sticks a little tighter to the boots and you're constantly flinging your leg to kick that off, that's a pretty good indication of a higher mag soil. The stickier that soil, generally the higher the mag level.
Yep. So now that we know, you got a little bit of a chemistry lesson with Sean and Bodie here, right? So we know that we have a 2 plus charge, 2 plus charge, 1 plus charge, 1 plus charge, 1 plus charge. Now, these two 1 plus charge have 0%, right? They don't register on the base saturation, very low concentrations, okay? Not a bad thing, not a great thing. It is what it is. Now, if I'm looking at this and Sean comes to me and he says, you know, you've got to get your base saturations up to 6%. The first question that I have in my mind is, how do I do it? How do I do it? Because the soil's always going to occupy itself with these 3 cations in this order. Calcium being first, magnesium being second, potassium being third. So if there's an abundance of calcium, your soil's going to take it first. If there's more magnesium than there is calcium, it's going to take all of the magnesium. When you get to potassium, finally, it will take what it has available of that and will hold it. So my point is if you look at this graph here, I have 13.26 chairs occupied by calcium. I have 3.4 chairs occupied by magnesium. So if we did a little pie chart, I think it would look something like this is all that I had, and maybe it would look a little something like this for magnesium, right? And then everything else is going to be filled in with calcium. So the reason I share that is twofold. Is one, understand your base saturation. This is a very quick, simple, you can do this, you can calculate this at home. You take your base saturation percentage multiplied by your CECs. Think about it as a dinner table with your CEC representing how many chairs you have available, and really start to ask yourself, do I have the available exchange sites there to increase my potassium load? So what am I getting at? I'm getting at, if you had hydrogen or if you had sodium here, it would be a little easier for you to displace those, right? Those both being 1+ charges, potassium being 1+ charge, knowing that it would take calcium, magnesium, potassium first, and then it'll take these others, right? So we talked about that hydrogen occupies the space that calcium wants to. So let's just say, for example, that this was a 5% hydrogen and calcium would be a 73%. Really nothing to change there. No need to change the calcium. You have enough calcium. Your pH is probably not out of whack. And you might, in this instance, have the ability to put some potassium on and have the chance to hold it. But in the previous example, when this goes back to a 78, when this goes back to a 0, there's not a tremendous amount of available exchange sites for you to hold it. So how do I know this to be true? Well, I had a grower, and I hope that he watches this video, but I had a grower that I worked with in Western Illinois, West Central. He had soils in that 25 CEC range. He had mag levels that were anywhere from 22 to 26. They were a heavy, tight soil, right? One of the best things that he could do would be run drainage and then try to pour the calcium to it. However, he had heard some folks talking about, I got to get my base saturations to 6%, 7%, 8%, right? And so he did what I think any reasonable human being would do is that if I need to put more potassium on to increase my base sats, I'm going to put potash on, right? And so he'd been doing this. I didn't know any of this as a backstory. We started working together, and we did, through the 365 program, we took soils and tissues. He did 3 or 4 fields. I got a field back, and we're looking at the tissues, and he says, okay, well, what should I do? And I said, well, these other farms, everything's okay, but this one farm, you really need to address some potassium. And he was irate. He was just downright livid. And the reason being is that, and I didn't know this, is he said, for the last 3 years, I've put 500 pounds of potash on every year. So in 3 years, he'd put 1,500 pounds of potassium on. And that was the field that I told him through soil and tissue program that was struggling with K. He'd never had anybody take the time to explain base saturations, and that I don't care if you put 2,000 pounds of potassium on, you're not going to get a 1+ charge cation to displace a 2+ charge cation. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at, in those instances, moving your potash applications to in season might be one way for you to pick up not only some yield, but economic efficiencies. Don't think that you have to run the 310 pounds of potash that you maybe typically would with a removal rate or a 2-year spread. And we're going to talk about that a little more in detail, because I want to make sure that I give some detail about this soil test. I shared a little bit towards the tail end of what this program has been, and I want to put numbers to it. So what we're going to do is just give us a second to clean this board off. We're going to clean this board off, and we're going to put some numbers to what our fertility budget is. And when we talk about it at Biodyne and BW that we're not anti-fertilizer, we're just pro-farmer efficiency, we want to show you how we're accomplishing that.
Okay, so we got the board cleaned up from talking about the base saturations, and what we're going to do now is we're going to put some economic, so we're going to look at the economics of what we've been talking about here. So if you remember, we're going to continue talking about the same farm we have been, the same soil test that we've shown in the last episode and on this one. And so if you saw the episode before, we talked about this farm that is one of Bodie's family's farms, and their historical fertilizer program on this farm. And so what they had traditionally done for the last 5 years, based on what this indicator tests are telling them, their spread program has been no MAP or DAP, so no phosphate applied, and they're applying about 75 pounds of potash each year in season over the top. And so we wanted to kind of break down the economics with what fertilizer prices are doing now to kind of show you where we're at price-wise in that system. So what they had done previous to using the indicator test, where they've applied no MAP or DAP and only the 75 pounds of potash, was they had been traditionally operating on a 2-year removal spread. So say using tri-state Rex and removal values, which would have been about 185 pound of MAP and about 310 pound of potash for a 2-year spread. So every other year they would apply that 185 and 310. And so now we're at 0 and 75. So let's do that with today's dollars on our fertilizer prices. And so we're looking at, you know, every place is a little bit different, but for those spring acres, we're hearing, you know, $800 MAP per ton, $700 potash. So let's do the math on that, Bodie. What is 185 pound of MAP and 310 pound of potash cost us per acre?
So at $800 a ton MAP, that is 40 cents per pound of product, right? 40 cents per pound of product. Mm-hmm. So 185 times that, $74 an acre for a 2-year spread. Potash at 700 is going to be 35 cents a pound. So at 310, 0.35 times 310 is 108.50. So 108.50 per acre. So over here, that's been 0. Over here, we'll take that same 0.35 times 75. So 26.25. Now we need to multiply that by 2 to be equivalent to a 2-year spread, right? So 26 times 2 is going to be 52.50, I think. Yep. Mm-hmm. So times 2 equals 52.50 per acre. With our dry fertilizer budget, this would be 182.50. 182.50 per acre.
What's the difference between?
Write that a little bit better there for those that can't see that. So that's $130.
Yep,
so
on the nose.
Net gain of 130. But we need to make sure that we back out the cost of our microbes. Yep. And so we've got Meltdown and 401, call the combination $20.
Yep.
So less the $20 for Meltdown 401, and we have a net gain equal to $110 per acre over a 2-year spread. Divide that back by 2, which would be the equivalent of $55 an acre per year.
So I think that this is huge. These numbers are huge. This is putting together what we've been talking about using these indicator soil tests. I think the thing that we should stress is we're not making a blanket recommendation for anybody to say, okay, use our microbes, spread 75 pound of potash, don't spread any MAP or DAP. There's a lot of farms that we're seeing that we can do this with, but this is not a blanket recommendation to cut these products out. We have to have the data, and we have to have, you know, we feel like, Bodie and I talk about this all the time. We are both, you know, classically trained, so to speak, with a standard soil test. And if someone hands us a standard soil test now, we're going to help them the best that we can. But that data is only so valuable because it doesn't tell us, you know, it doesn't tell us our biological numbers. It doesn't give us true plant availability, or I guess true nutrient availability. And so, you know, we realize that not everybody's going to run out to send samples to Next Level Ag to get the indicator test. But for us, the best method of gaining confidence that we can start doing some of these things is having those numbers. Now we can get a base saturation from a lot of tests, and we can kind of get to that potash number from what we've done, from what we've just described. But when you get to that phosphate side, we really need to kind of see, you know, what the numbers are and what we can make available to understand where we are, and then we can work on, you know, cutting those rates or adjusting those phosphate rates based upon that.
So I think it's easy for us to tell you where it works,
Yeah.
right? Like we can tell you where it works. The question is where do you break them? How do you break them, right? So I had a grower that he called in and he said, you know, I've tried a lot of biological companies before and the product didn't work, right? So I'm thinking, okay, he's tried a lot of different biologicals, it didn't work. All right, so I'm thinking about this, right? And I asked him, I said, well, why do you think it doesn't work? Well, he has his opinions, right? And he said, well, I've seen what you guys are doing on Twitter, and I'm just really intrigued by yours. So it dawned on me, I asked him a question. I said, what's your pH? He said, well, I'm a 4.9 or a 5.0. And I politely said back to him, sir, the only biological you need is lime. Let's get that issue fixed first. And then let's look at adding the biology in. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at we know where our biology work really well as far as the soil pH goes. We know where they don't work well. And if you are a grower that has a 4.5 or a 4.9 or a 5 or a 5.1 or a 5.2, the first dollar that you should look at spending would be putting lime on.
Sure.
And I think that we both would agree with that.
Yeah.
I think our company stance would be the same way. We want you to have a great experience with our biology. We know where it works. We also know where it doesn't work. And so if you're a grower that is experiencing that side, put some lime on, get your pHs up, and then let's have a conversation about biology. Let's have a conversation about nutrient solubilization and nutrient availability, because as you've seen this, again, this is on our own farm. Our yields aren't going down. Our yields over the last 5 years have only gotten stronger from where they have been historically. Our soil test levels are not, which would be against common teaching. They're not going down. We're not pulling from the soil. We're actually making more nutrients available. Our soil tests continue to climb, and our yields continue to climb, all while we're saving $55 an acre a year or $110 an acre over a 2-year spread. And again, we're not anti-fertilizer. We're just pro-farm efficiency. And with prices where they're at today, you know, the question is where do I invest my dollars, right? And where do I invest my dollars for the greatest return? And don't take just this one example, right? This is an example that I have data. You've seen the data now. Another example that I would give before I would leave you with is with this. We had a grower in northwest Iowa who had a 260-acre field. And he has not put any MAP on in 6 years. He's been on the Meltdown 401 program for that 6 years. We've seen the same thing in his soils. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, that's Northwest Iowa, right?
Sure.
Their soils are way better than what mine are. But we had seen the same thing. He's in an elevated pH area. They're going to be in that 6.9 to 7.4 range. Sometimes they get up as high as 7.8. Anyways, he was around the 7.2 area on this particular field. Phosphate numbers continued to climb on soil availability. Potassium levels were starting to get a little bit stronger as well. Not applying commercial fertilizer. This year, the grower added no MAP again, so this would be year 7. Mm-hmm. And he had 110 pounds of potassium through a top dress application as well as a Y drop 0013. Mm-hmm. And that grower had a 302 bushel average across the 260-acre field. I guess I share that not as any sort of a brag. I share that simply because that's a completely different environment. Weather related, it's a completely different environment. Soil from Indiana, this is a 17 CEC, that's a 33, 34 sure. CEC, so double, as far as the holding capacity. But seeing, 302 bushels across the 260-acre field is pretty fascinating. So we've given you a couple things, and I don't know whether you've picked up on them or not. I would say stay tuned for the next week because I think you're going to be interested. We've talked a lot about phosphorus. We've hinted around a little bit about potassium. You might be asking yourself right now, well, what does potassium have anything to do with biology?
Right. Well, and I'm going to throw one more thing in, Bodie, because we've got to throw our salesman hat on at some point in time, right? And so we've talked about this. We've got this up here. We've got it written right here. Okay, the main thing that I want to stress before we close out of this video is we can do this. We gain the confidence to do this because of this. All right, we've all seen on social media, someone talks about a neighbor that they had that never spread fertilizer and he mined his soils, right? And we probably can all find an example in our neighborhood of that. That is right here is the difference, okay? I think I can't stress enough that biology making phosphorus more available, maybe what Bodie's leading into, maybe we're making potassium more available, but our biology is what's making that click. And if we don't apply the biology and we just decide we're not going to spread fertilizer to save money, we absolutely can see the potential for mining soils.
Agreed 100%.
So with that, we'll see you next episode.